So when you're talking about the things that are taken off the table, and I want to get back to, like, I'm glad we're jumping into the theory part of it, but I want to get back to practical application for people who are dealing with stuff in a second. But before I go there, one quick question. You're talking about the things that were taken off the table with this marriage or this mutation.
Mm-hmm.
I've often wondered why we haven't seen an explosion of this idea of transracialism yet, where people can claim because if biological sex is a social construct, which they are now saying, the same way that, and that race is a social construct, which back when I was learning this stuff 20 years ago in college, I was learning all about race as a social construct. That logically, and again, I know they're not consistent, but if they were, you would think that at some point you would see a large portion of people saying, well, I identify, like Rachel Dolezal, I identify as black. So, but so far it seemed they seem to have really the SJWs I know have really prevented that from moving forward. And what is the difference there between gender and race? Why is one off limits?
Yeah, they're theorized differently. Now we can talk about why on two different levels, but we'll do the theory one first, and maybe we'll get a little into people's heads second. I like to try to stay out of people's heads, but maybe it's necessary a little now. Okay, so theory. Queer theory positioned the idea, and that's where trans issues come out of, or trans ideology comes out of, is out of queer theory, that it seems very natural that we're stuck into our sexes, male and female, and they position the idea that being stuck into your sex is itself the oppression. And so queer theory said that you affect liberation. So remember, liberation is the solid core here of their ideology. You affect liberation by breaking down the meaning in stable categories. You get rid of the stable categories. Okay, so trans is kind of like the pinnacle of that, because you have people who are literally crossing from one identification to another very willfully, therefore saying that the basis of the categories themselves is something that can be transgressed. So the goal of queer theory is to remove social significance from sexual, gender, and sexuality categories. That's very important. Race, on the other hand, was theorized exactly the opposite. It was to put social significance back into race. And if you look historically, you can see why. What was happening was that all of these liberation movements were using all of the racism to do their radical activism, and racism was just becoming a less and less credible argument. People cared less and less about race, and therefore they had to increase the amount of significance. However, that wasn't what was going on with the LGBT movement. And in fact, I should just say really the L and G movement. I forget what they called the alliance that they had initially. It was just lesbians and gays. And the point of being a lesbian is that you're a woman that's attracted to a woman. And the point of being gay is that you're a man that is attracted to a man. So that requires man and woman to be stable categories in both, and that sexual orientation itself can be stable. So they had to move away from the idea in queer theory that those are stable categories, because that's required in order to break down A, heteronormativity, male attracted to female, and then B, the kind of normalization of gayness that was trying to happen with male and male gay and female lesbian. That normalization is the enemy in queer theory, because that normalization is what upholds heteronormativity, which is that most people are male-female attracted, and that's okay. That people see that as okay. They see that as the problem. So that's the thing that has to be destroyed at all costs. So you have to take all meaning out of those categories. With race, it was very different. People became less and less concerned with what race people were. And so you have to put social significance back into racial categories, and you have to make it so that what gives that social significance is the experience of having been that race. So we can get into the experience side now. So within racial politics, within critical race theory specifically, the idea is that the lived experience of oppression, of being a particular racial category, is what gives you insight into how the world works. In queer theory, it's that the lived experience of not being able to transgress your sexuality or your gender or your sex is what causes the oppression that you have to be liberated from. So you have this opposite directions of theorizing of identities with regard to sex, gender, and sexuality versus race. Now, that's the theory reason. That's the theory reason. Get in their heads. Massive people were realizing there was massive social cachet in being able to play into their race, and they don't want that exclusive social cash to spread to other people. That's it.
Yes.
The black people were benefiting very explicitly from affirmative action for a while. Then this diversity, equity, inclusion stuff came in. There were definite advantages being given to black people. Not only were we looking at the lack of social significance in race, it was no longer a means for somebody to be special and to lean on their identity to get ahead, and you actually have to go forward on your merits, which is hard. So attack meritocracy. Now you have actually advantages. Not to say that there wasn't still racism, and not to say that there weren't still wealth gaps and lots of other problems. You don't have to dismiss any of that to say that the reality of the times was that everybody knew that black culture was the coolest culture. Everybody knew that. Everybody knows that still. Like, they're just cool people. It's just cool culture. And that's why they have cultural appropriation. They're scared everybody's going to steal their cool stuff and profit off of it where they didn't get to. It's very clear, like, the mentality, what's happening here. And so if you're going to preserve access there, and especially if you're going to launch a all-out rhetorical and social assault on whiteness, you can't allow white people to abandon their whiteness. So, I mean, that's basically the long and short. Theoretically, they say that whiteness is a property that all people that are white happen to get. They can't avoid being complicit in that. Obviously, if you're being given a statement that you're complicit in a sin and you're being manipulated based on that, and there's a lot of power based on that, you can't let people say, nah, I changed my mind, I'm trans, I'm black now, I've been hanging out in the hood, and I'm out of that. It's like, you can't let it happen.
So why with women, though? Why? So as a group, women also, I would argue, it became, at this time in history, talking about, it became beneficial to be a woman also with affirmative action. Or you see in the social justice world now, it's like they will look at a panel, for example, at a science conference and say, I'm not going to be at this conference until there's 50% representation on the panel. And so women are getting positions just simply for being a woman. Why is it, though, that women allowed this, I guess, invasion into the category of woman in a way that you didn't see the black people allow this invasion into the category of black? What is it about women that makes them more amenable to this?
I don't think it's that they're more amenable to it, to be honest. I think it's that the sex, gender, sexuality triad had already linked them into solidarity across those lines. So the feminist movement was much more invested in the queer theory kind of thing that offshot from it. Judith Butler started off clearly within feminist theory, and then eventually it switched into queer theory as she went further. You see the paper Doing Gender was clearly within feminism as it was slowly morphing into gender studies. In fact, the paper Doing Gender, which is a 1987 paper, is probably indicative of the real shift to gender studies out of just feminism. And so there was already a ton of investment there that prevented feminist women, who were the only women doing any of this anyway, to have any ground to stand on to push back. Because if they were going to, they would say, oh, well, you just don't care about your, lesbian sisters, or you don't care about your bi and trans, these issues. You've got to care about these. You can't be exclusive like this, blah, blah, blah. And of course, what you really had also going on was this kind of rash of very angry lesbian separatist type radical feminists that were at the time in the late 70s going into the 80s, who were massively losing popularity. So they didn't look like the cool hip kids anymore. The gay rights movement's flaring up. So all of a sudden you have the feminists who are going to back up the gay rights movement and the feminists who aren't, where gay rights movement is starting to be this blurry double meaning, where the queer theorists are actually starting to take over the definitions. So they didn't have the ground to stand on, whereas the black feminism, from the perspective of anybody that's not black or feminist or woman, is like, woo, can't touch that. How are you going to poke both of those at the same time and criticize that? So the black feminists who are putting forth this identity first politic coming out of black power were very much different. And also, I mean, you got to look at what the feminists were doing. The feminists at the time, radical feminists going back to like freaking the second sex, like 1949, the feminists were already trying to break down the category of gender while maintaining the category of sex. So they were already in the investment of breaking down categories. They just didn't have any ground to stand on. Whereas the Black liberation movement was Black power. So it's like dump investment into the racial category. And so they've been already for decades going in divergent directions. And by the time this kind of intersectionality thought started to come into the fore, they just didn't have ground to stand on to do it. So I don't think that we will ever see transracial arguments. Like transracial race will just cease to become a significant category where anybody cares before we will see a transracial argument backed up and accepted by this kind of theory.
Wow. Well, that explains a little bit about because I can't remember the paper, the person who published it, but last year there was the dust up of the academic who published a paper about transracialism. And
Rebecca Tuvell at Hypatia.
Okay. And it went nowhere.
Blew up. Well, it blew up. It went the opposite of nowhere. So this was actually it was before we did our papers. So it was in like 2016 or 17. And it actually was accepted by Hypatia. She argued that she did a philosophical argument that said the arguments for transracialism parallel perfectly the arguments for transgenderism. Therefore, why are we not doing this? Why is this not a thing? And what happened was Hypatia accepted it and published it, and the public outcry went berserk. And it went so bad that Hypatia ended up having all of its editorial board resign. They had to reform their editorial board completely. They were coming after Rebecca Tuvell's PhD. They had the paper, I don't remember if they ended up getting it retracted or if Hypatia tried to stand by it. I don't remember the exact details, but it was a, all out struggle.
I think they retracted it.
I think so too. It was an all-out struggle session against the journal and Rebecca Tuvell for having dared transgress this idea. I mean, it was a meltdown. And the scary part of that one was I remember reading that Rebecca Tuvell said that there were scholars that she had been friends with like her whole career and long time in her life who were writing to her in private saying, I support you. I hope everything's okay, blah, blah, blah. And then writing public denunciations of her at the same time.
I guess that's the definition of cancel culture lately, right? That's how it works.
That's mental. Yeah. That's absolutely mental. That's happening. I have to make the public statement against you, but privately I support you. Don't worry. Don't tell anybody. You have my support. I can't imagine, by the way, as a human being, how pissed off I'd be at anybody who did that to me. The people who are just trashing me, I'd be kind of mad at, but people who did that duplicitous stuff, oh man. I can't even express how mad I'd be about those people. Like they thought they were being a friend. It's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
This stuff's evil, man. This stuff is evil.